Brandy Lowry, and I am with Lone Star Legal Aid. I am in the Individual Safety Unit, and we are at our third episode, The Safe Space. And today's topic, we will be talking about male survivors, and it will be in honor of Movember. As everybody knows, this is the month of November, and November also is known for Movember, which means that it's an annual event involving the growing of mustaches during the month of November to raise awareness about men's health, like prostate cancer, men's suicide, male survivorship. So that's why we want to discuss. Before we get started, I want to make a disclaimer. This is only for informational purposes. We are not giving legal advice, and this is only to take away to provide information. So, but before we get started, we have three wonderful guests today. We have Christopher and Jessica from Landwidth. Thank you for joining our show. And we have Emiliano from TASA. So please introduce yourself to our listeners and give a brief background. We can start with Christopher.
Hi, well, thanks for allowing me to take part in this presentation. I'm Christopher Tracy. I'm the managing attorney for the LASA office for Legal Aid of Northwest Texas. Prior to coming to the LASA office, I was a supervisor for our Weatherford branch. And prior to that, I worked in Fort Worth, where I used to go out and do intake at One Safe Place. I was a staff attorney in Fort Worth for several years, and really appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for being here. Jessica, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Jessica Robinson. I am the supervising attorney for the LASA unit of Legal Aid of Northwest Texas. Prior to taking this position, I was a staff attorney in the Fort Worth office. I was on the VOCA grant at that time, and so I represented survivors of domestic violence. Prior to that, I lived in Georgia and was practicing criminal defense.
And Emiliano, please introduce yourself to our listeners. You're on mute. We can't hear you. Do you have your the mute button on? Like the microphone, is it X'd out on your computer? Well, while we have a little bit of technical difficulty, let's go ahead and get started. And hopefully Emiliano can come on. He is part of our TASA network, and he is an advocate for TASA. So can y'all hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, as attorneys for Legal Aid of Northwest Texas and both being part of the LASA network, what does sexual violence against men look like for each of you? Have you had experience with dealing with male survivors, and what does it look like? Oh, Emiliana, you back? Can you hear us? We can't hear you. Please bear with us, y'all. We are trying a new system out, so this is all new to us. So we are trying to work out our technical difficulties. No, I can read your lips, but we can't hear you. It's okay. Let's try this again. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So what sexual violence against men look like? And Christopher, this can be for you. We'll start with you.
You know, sexual violence against men, there's a lot of similarities to the violence that women face. Any kind of forced, unwanted sexual contact, you know, that also applies to men as well. So, you know, it's very, even, you know, in terms of the parts of the body and things like that, that those are going to be different, but the unwanted sexual contact, and, you know, or forced sexual contact, it's going to be similar to what women are experiencing as well. Jessica, what is your thought on that?
Sorry to take myself off mute. So to me, what sexual violence against men looks like Chris was saying, is very similar to what it looks like against women. So any unwanted contact, rape is going to be a little different from just sexual assault in and of itself, because that involves specifically any type of penetration. But the effects of it and the the trauma that it causes are going to be the same no matter if your survivor is male or female. You asked earlier about just our experience, in our office, at least with male survivors of sexual assault. And I was actually talking to Chris about this before we got on. But in my experience, and we'll talk about that more later, there aren't a lot of men who report any instances of sexual assault or things like that have happened to them. And so what I've seen lately is that we will have applicants or people who come in who are survivors or male survivors, and they're talking about, and they want to get advice on an incident that happened years ago. And they've just gotten to the point where they are comfortable with talking about it, maybe have sought counseling or have sought treatment. And we do have to talk to them about the statute of limitations on those types of criminal charges and what kind of action can be taken now. So what I've seen is, although there is more of a stigma, in my opinion, for men reported issues of sexual assault and incidents of sexual violence, it is something that we all need to be more aware of, because it is out there and it is happening.
So let's go back real quick, because you used a big word and some of our listeners are not part of the legal community. So you said statute of limitations. What does that mean? So
that is basically a time bar as to when someone can be charged with a crime. And that's going to be different depending on what type of crime it is. Mm-hmm. And it's also going to vary from state to state. So, for example, depending on the age of a victim, a rape charge may have a statute of limitation of, a lifetime. So they can always be brought. Whereas some other type of sexual assault, because sexual assault runs the gamut, we're not just rape, we're talking about any kind of unwanted sexual contact. And so whether or not you're able to actually ask the police to investigate and prosecute the person who did this to you is going to depend on what that statute of limitations is, or what time bar the law has put on it.
So I know, like in my personal experience, because we all handle more civil law than we do criminal law. I've had male survivors that are usually dealing with like either protective orders or even evictions, other civil types. So I just want to make it clear, with Legal Aid of Northwest Texas and also Lone Star Legal Aid, we do not handle the criminal matters, but we can assist when it comes to a male survivor in helping you get out of that situation on the civil side. Emiliano, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emiliano Diaz-Ayuan. I'm the Men's Engagement Specialist with the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. Good afternoon. So happy to be with you. Thank you for the invitation to be a part of this discussion.
Well, thank you for being here. So we are just getting started on the first question. And I'm going to ask you this question because you are you're an advocate. So we would love to hear from you. What does sexual violence against men look like? What experience have you had with dealing with male survivors?
Thank you for that question. Sexual violence is any forced, coerced, unwanted sexual contact, period, right? So we know that unfortunately boys and men also experience sexual violence, but it's not something that we usually talk about. So to be able to have this type of opportunity to engage in a discussion about the experiences of male survivors of sexual violence, I think is really unique. I want to encourage folks to have more of those conversations. We need to have more of these dialogues about both the rights of victims and survivors, as well as what types of services are available to them. So I think this is really a unique opportunity. My work is with male survivors has been primarily as a victim advocate. And so I've been very fortunate to work for a number of domestic violence rape crisis centers around the state of Texas. I've been with TASA now for 12 years, providing training and technical assistance to rape crisis centers around victim advocacy and prevention, education with boys and men. And the reality is that they, the folks on the front line, the victim advocates, the folks who are answering hotline calls, who are accompanying victims and survivors in the hospital when they're getting, when they're collecting evidence for a rape kit. Those are the folks that are doing the work every day with boys and men who experience sexual violence. And so our job here at TASA is to support those individual victim advocates and to ensure that they're successful in terms of providing those basic services, whether it's legal advocacy, court accompaniment, assistance with housing, transportation, all the sort of the basic needs that any victim or survivor will have. And so, I just want to give them a shout out, because that's the really important hard work of working with victims and survivors and working with them to heal, right? Providing the counseling and the therapy that male survivors need, on a long-term basis. And so shout out to them for doing that work every day, and for the attorneys who work with victims and survivors of sexual violence, especially those who have who are working with boys and men who have experienced some form of sexual violence and are working through the criminal justice system in terms of looking for justice to hold their perpetrator accountable. So it's important work, and it's not work that we can do alone. Everyone that is watching can join and support the work that's being done at your local rape crisis center, whether it's volunteering, donating, or just encouraging a victim or survivor in your life to access support and services here in Texas.
I appreciate that. Thank you for that. So in your experience, and this is to all three of y'all, is there a typical demographics of male survivors? Is there an age range that you see, like maybe from, like, is it mostly boys? Is it men? Does the age range? Is it, majority one race versus another? I know I threw a couple of questions at one time, but like, what are you typically seeing in the demographics of male survivors?
The Centers for Disease Control have statistics that they keep. Obviously, we're dealing with a situation where a lot of assaults are not being reported, and so the numbers are not necessarily, they're going to be higher than the numbers that the CDC has. But 1 in 4 male rape victims experienced it for the first time between the ages of 11 and 17, and I know Jessica was talking about how we'll have survivors of sexual assault come to us years later for services, and we may or may not be able to get a protective order at that point. But the thing is that the approach is multifaceted. So at that point, we can help with civil legal needs like barrier removal, assistance with getting a license or getting an expungement, or there's a lot of other civil legal needs that we can provide to survivors by just providing that ear. When they come in and they want to tell us their story and we believe them, and I may not be able to get the protective order at that point, just depending on the situation, but there are so many other legal services that we can provide then. CDC also is saying that 1 in 38 men have experienced completed or attempted rape during their lifetime. And that's a shocking statistic, but those numbers are probably low, given the reporting, the stigma that's attached to reporting assaults that happen on males in our society.
So this is a twofold, because we're using big words that some people in the legal community don't know. Barrier removal. Chris, can you explain what that means?
Yeah, sure. So, when we are going through life, especially for those of us who haven't experienced the inability to get things like a driver's license or to apply for a job and not have something that's on our background pop up and prevent us from getting that position, for those of us who haven't experienced that sort of thing, it's hard to understand that there are things, maybe small things out there that are these civil barriers that can keep people from being successful or from reaching their true potential. Maybe they were sexually assaulted and it caused them to get addicted to drugs, or to get in a situation where maybe they lost their license, or they never even got a license. Maybe they never even learned to drive. Those are barriers. Those are things that keep people from reaching their true potential. And what we try to do is, when we have someone come to us, male or female, and they have a situation where, they can't get a job because there's one of those barriers in place, we try to remove those. We try to get them to a point where they can be successful.
And that's awesome work. And that's something that people definitely need to know about that when they do come and seek out our services. Emiliano, as an advocate, what type of demographics are you seeing that comes across to your organization?
Yeah, I think it's important for the audience to understand that men of all races, sexual orientations, ages, socioeconomic backgrounds, religions can experience sexual violence, right? But I think I want to point folks to a very specific statistic that hasn't been shared. 1 in 6 boys will be sexually abused before they turn 18 years old, right? So 1 in 6 boys. Think about the boys in your life. The boys that you love, the boys that you maybe coach or mentor, and think about the reality that one of them could experience sexual violence. And I think that's really important for us to really reflect on it and to think about what it is that we can do to ensure that doesn't happen, right? Because all of us have a responsibility to protect each other, intervene whenever we believe or witness a form of violence or abuse, sexual harassment, or even if we believe that a boy is being sexually abused, right? So it's really important that as adults and as mandatory reporters, all of us should want to encourage all of us, if you believe that a boy is experiencing some form of abuse or sexual abuse, I want to encourage you to report that, to your local law enforcement or child protective services, and allow them to do the investigation to determine. But I think when it comes to sexual violence and sexual abuse, we need to have conversations with the people in our lives so that they know if they experience something along that continuum of sexual violence, that they can come to us and talk to us, and that we are going to do everything in our power to ensure their safety. And so those conversations are really important. This is a great place to start, to begin to think about and to leave this Facebook Live and to have a conversation with the boys in your life, whether it's your nephew, whether it's your son, whether it's your grandson, to talk about what is appropriate, what kinds of touches are not okay, and the process, like how important it is for them to talk to somebody, to tell an adult that they trust about what is happening to them, or about maybe what they witnessed in terms of some form of violence or abuse. So I think that's the best prevention, is just engaging in conversations with the boys and men in our lives, and this is an important place to start that conversation.
Who are usually the perpetrators when dealing with sexual violence against men?
Although the majority of perpetrators are male, men can also be sexually assaulted by women and girls, right? So we know that the majority of perpetrators are male. just based on the data that we have in terms of what we talked about in terms of what has been reported. And so, but we do want to acknowledge that girls and women can also abuse boys and men, and especially girls and women who are in power, who are in positions of authority over that boy. So that's important to think about, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a coach, whether it's it could be any number, your probation officer, it could be like just anybody, a police officer, somebody who is responsible for juveniles in detention, right? So these are individuals with some sort of access and power and authority over those boys and men. But most of the time, the perpetrator are people that we know and that we love and that we live with, right? Unfortunately, these are the people that are the closest to us, that live in our homes, that are family members, that are friends. So I think it's important for us to understand that the majority of sexual violence and sexual abuse is committed by individuals, that we know, not by strangers. Even though that does exist, but the vast majority of sexual violence and sexual abuse, when we talk about boys and men, are people that they know and that they love, right? That they trust. And I think that's why it's so important to engage in this conversation with each other, right? So that we can ensure that the safety of all of our boys and men in our community, so that it doesn't happen to anyone. We talked about the statistics. We want to bring that down to zero, right? We don't want anyone in our community here in Texas to experience sexual violence. And that is our mission here at TASA, is to end sexual violence in Texas, but we can't do that alone, right? The rape crisis centers, the legal advocates, they can't do that alone. We need everyone who is watching this to do their part and to have conversations with the boys and men in their lives about this issue, about consent, about boundaries, about healthy sexual behavior, healthy sexual activity. So all of those things are really important to just have a conversation. If folks leave with just that one thing and have a conversation with a boy and man in their life about this issue, that will we're going to begin to create a ripple effect in our state.
So we also know with perpetrators, a lot of times, a majority of times, they tend to pray or they seek out a particular type of, they're looking for something. So in each of your experience, and anyone can chime in at any time, do perpetrators have a particular type of boy or male that they're looking for, like any characteristics or demographics for them to seek out? Or is it just like, oh, I see this person, let me try?
I think to piggyback off of the last answer, what we've seen is that these perpetrators and abusers, they thrive off of control and thrive off of power. So these are people that are in positions of power or have gotten to the point where they are able to seek out people who are needing something, who are missing something, and they put on, like they can fill that void for someone. And it becomes more of a control issue than actually helping. And I think a lot of times that's where the abuse starts, is that your survivor has developed trust. And so we see that a lot of times when you're dealing with coaches or when you're dealing with, different team activities and that kind of thing, because your players, your survivors are developing a trust with this coach or with this person who has control, who has the ability to make decisions about what happens with their future, that kind of thing. And we see a lot of abuse happening in those situations. Also, too, we were looking at some stats earlier, and we found that 90% of people with developmental disabilities have experienced some type of sexual abuse. So I think that all turns back to control, and it all turns back to power. And it's more so being able to exercise that control and seeking out those people that you can control and manipulate in these situations.
So are y'all familiar with the power and control wheel?
Yes.
You know, usually we talk about the power and control wheel in regards to domestic violence and sexual assault violence against women. So can that be used as the same for male survivors as well?
Yeah, I would actually encourage folks to look at, just to Google the continuum of sexual aggression, right? There's actual a continuum. It's not necessarily it helps folks understand how sexual violence can begin with very mundane acts, whether it's forms of sexual harassment, even the showing a boy or man pornography, right, before they're an adult, right? So grooming boys, making them comfortable with those types of those sexual activities or sexual behavior. So if folks want to sort of get a sense of, again, that really begins with verbal forms of abuse that go all the way to rape, and eventually eventually to rape, right? And so it's important for folks to understand that can occur on a continuum, and that that it looks different for different perpetrators and offenders. They're going to engage in different activities. They're going to groom their victim differently, right? There's no one. We can't predict who will be an offender or a perpetrator. There are a lot of because they have all the same backgrounds in terms of the victim, right? They're different ages, they're different races, they're different sexual orientations. We know from the research that the majority of perpetrators are heterosexual men or straight men, right? So it's important for us to understand that sexual violence occurs in all communities of faith and all socioeconomic backgrounds. So the perpetrator and the offender, again, can be any individual, but again, predominantly, we know that individual will more than likely be a male. So I think it's important for folks to just kind of get a sense and to understand what sexual violence looks like. It's not just rape, right? There are other forms of sexual violence and sexual abuse that boys and men experience on that continuum of sexual aggression. So I would encourage folks to Google that and to explore that a little bit, and to have, again, to talk to the boys and men in our lives, regardless of their age, about these things, right? It's important that we have these conversations, honest conversations, age-appropriate conversations about this issue, because the more that we can talk about it, the more that we can remove the shame, the fear, the guilt. When boys and men experience that, right, they're going to be more than likely to come to us and talk to us about their experiences or seek out help, right? And so right now we know that the reporting is low amongst boys and men because of the shame, the guilt, because of the fear that they're not going to be bullied by law enforcement. They're not going to be bullied by family and friends, because they know that the perpetrator, the offender, again, is someone that is trusted, is well liked, that is respected. That's an important figure in the community. That's a community leader or a faith leader. So I think there are all of these underlying reasons why boys and men don't come forward and report their abuse.
And actually, that was one of the questions we were going to segue into. But what I want to expound on at the moment is, like, what are some common reactions with male survivors? And like maybe with Christopher and Jessica, when they come to y'all seeking legal advice, and Emiliano, when they're coming to seeking, advocacy help, what other reactions are you getting? Are they mostly like shut down, closed off? Are they guarded? Because again, a lot of men do not report their abuse, and they're afraid to report their abuse, or they're ashamed because there's always a stigma in society, that this doesn't, men are supposed to be strong and this doesn't happen to them. So what are some of the reactions that you get when they are coming to and trying to seek help? And that, so I can start with Christopher. We'll start with you.
I think it depends. Sometimes you'll see the lack of affect at first. But I think that in the situation where you have someone who's a survivor, you're gonna spend additional time. It's not like an intake where you're going to be there for 45 minutes. It might take a while and you may cycle in and out of current facts and then past incidents. And a lot of times survivors have experienced trauma, not just once, but there may be a more recent trauma that has brought up abuse that they just never reported. And so part of it is allowing a safe space where the survivor can tell you their story, where they can reveal all the things that they need to tell you. And, understanding that there may be a situation where they're going to be emotionally distraught at some point because they're, finally having an ability to say some of the things that they haven't been able to tell anyone, not even, close family members or clergy or anybody else. And they're sitting with an attorney and they find that they're able to tell this stranger with a law degree things that they've never told anyone.
Mm-hmm. Jessica, your experience, like, have you had any different type of reactions, or what reactions have you had dealing with male survivors?
I think what I have noticed is that when a male survivor is telling the story of what happened, there's more blame, more of them kind of blaming themselves, either for what actually happened or for maybe waiting to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
I've been in a situation before where someone has said, even if there's nothing that can happen now, I just want to talk about it because it could be happening to someone else, right? And so I think that getting to the story and getting to the point where a male survivor is comfortable with talking about it is harder, just because of what you said, because of the stigma. And I think also too, especially when you're dealing with a survivor who experienced sexual assault when he was younger, he may have told a friend or a family member about that, and it was considered a good thing. You know what I mean? How many times have we heard stories where a young boy will lose his virginity, for example, to a much older woman?
Mm-hmm.
And instead of that being considered a problem, which it is, obviously, it's good for you, a kudos, a congratulations, without the understanding of what kind of trauma that causes, especially later on down the line when you're dealing with other types of relationships and dealing with the world in general. So I think trying to get the story out of a male survivor, and from my experience, is harder. But I also think that you can see more of the effect on them.
Mm-hmm.
Because in most situations, it's because they waited, because it wasn't something that was immediately reported, or it was reported and nobody took it seriously, or it was considered a joke.
And Emiliano, what are some of the reactions that you see when male survivors come to you for assistance?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of denial, right? And so when, that it didn't happen because they've been, again, especially if it's a family member or friend, there are going to be folks in their life that aren't going to believe them. So they begin to question themselves, right? Did this really happen to me? This couldn't have happened to me. There's this tremendous fear of appearing unmasculine, that I wasn't able to protect myself, right? Because as men, we're told that we have to be strong, that we can't let anybody hurt us. We can't let anybody abuse us, right? From a very early age, boys are told to be tough, to be strong. And when we're abused, then we're not men anymore. We're no longer masculine. So it's that fear. There's a lot of questioning around sexuality, right? Because it becomes very confusing in terms of their physical reaction to the sexual abuse, right? Which creates a tremendous amount of confusion in the male survivor. So there might be a lot of questions that come up about their sexuality. They might engage in risky or problematic sexual behavior. They might have they might internalize sort of homophobia is one of the things that happens for a lot of boys and men who experience sexual abuse. Is they internalize in that they engage in homophobic behavior and acts. Because again, they don't want to appear feminine or unmasculine, and they and there's again that confusion around sexuality, especially when their offender is another boy or man. So I think those are some of the unfortunate realities and things that I'm sure that you guys have talked about in terms of PTSD and again, shame. I think is probably the number one thing that I hear from male survivors in terms of the shame and the guilt, because then they feel responsible. They allowed the abuse to happen. They were in the wrong place or at the wrong time, or they felt they felt powerless in the situation. They didn't stop the abuse from happening. And so there's a tremendous amount of shame and guilt that comes with sexual abuse. That they live with for the rest of their life. So for both men and women who experience sexual violence and abuse, this requires tremendous amount of healing work, and it requires courage on their part, and it requires the support on our part to begin by believing and support them through whatever process that they choose in terms of their healing process, whether they want to report the abuse, whether they want to hold the individual accountable in the criminal justice system, whether they want to access legal services. So, our job as friends and family members, as advocates, is to support, encourage, and to provide information to that survivor throughout that process, wherever they're at on that process. So boys and men will come forward sometimes later in life, much later in life, where after the offender has passed away, or after the offender has moved on, or after the offender has been arrested for abusing other individuals in their community. So it's important that we're patient and that we do our best to understand that the experiences of male survivors is going to be different from the girls and women who experience sexual violence, and that they need different things as well. And so that's important for us to understand and to accept. So we have to think about services need to look different for boys and men who experience sexual violence. And that requires an internal conversation as an organization or as an agency about how we provide those services, when we provide those services, and who provides those services, right? Because I know that as a man, I might be more comfortable talking to a woman or talking to another man, or being able to talk to somebody in my preferred language, right? So we need to think about all those things, but most importantly, really listen to survivors and follow their guidance.
So what are some common myths or misconceptions about male survivors that y'all have experienced in your career?
Well, I mean, there's societal myths that keep getting propagated. Like if you've been sexually abused, then you're more likely to become an offender yourself, and that's just not true. And so those are things that society places upon survivors, and it's part of the conversation is letting the survivor know that not just that those exist, and that those types of things are not true, but maybe bringing them into the conversation. When you are talking to a survivor and letting them understand that those aren't your beliefs. Society has that belief. Those aren't yours. You're just you're there to listen. You're there to understand. You're there to provide support, to provide services, not to judge. But that's just one of the myths. And there are others. Jessica, there's I think we talked about that earlier.
We did, and one of the big ones to me, I know that we have talked about during this actual session, but one of the big ones to me is the myth that a woman cannot sexually assault a man. And I think that doesn't get talked about enough. I don't think there's enough of a discussion around that issue. Even when we are doing trainings or, we are doing, community outreach or that kind of thing, you have to catch yourself, because when you're talking, a lot of times when we're talking about abusers, we will say he. Well, you don't acknowledge at all that this abuser or, the person who is perpetrating this sexual assault can also be a woman. And a lot of times is a woman. And so that causes, I think, especially male survivors to distance themselves from reporting, to distance themselves from seeking the type of treatment that they may need, counseling, and any type of services, including legal services, because it's not something that they necessarily want to go in court and talk about because they don't feel like they'll be taken seriously. And so one of the biggest, issues to me, or one of the things that I think is the most important, is to acknowledge that the perpetrator can be anyone. And that does include women.
And to like piggyback on what you said, Jessica, I agree. And that's something that we don't talk about because, it's always been hyped up with males. It's like, oh, I was 14 and a woman 25 took advantage of me. But, and people tend to be like, oh, high five, that's great. But not knowing that, no, that's not good. She took advantage of a young boy and of his innocence. And so I think now we're starting to lean towards having more of those conversations versus even back then, or even I know growing up, I would have males that would mention that, and I'm, you're like, oh, but now it's like that wasn't a good thing. That wasn't good at 14 and 15-year-old. This, older woman took your innocence away.
Right.
Advantage of it. So it's not a good thing. And that definitely needs to be emphasized a lot as well, too, as that's not cool. An older woman is taking advantage of younger men or younger boys. Like, that's not a good thing. And Emiliano, what are some misconceptions that you see that?
Well, I appreciate this this particular question. I think it's important for the boys and men who are watching. If you've experienced some form of sexual violence or sexual abuse, you're going to have a physical reaction. You're going to have a physical response. And it's important to understand that doesn't mean that you really wanted it or that you consented to it, right? Just because you have a physical reaction doesn't mean anything, right? Especially if you didn't consent to it, and that can happen as a result of fear. That can be a result of the situation. So I think it's important for boys and men who are watching to understand that that consent is a yes, right, and it can be removed at any time, and that it's important for us to understand what you're talking about in terms of adults. Young boys cannot consent to engage in sexual activity with adults. That's just it's not okay, right? And it's important that there is consent in all of our sexual activity and all of our sexual behavior with our partner, whomever they may be, because we know that sexual violence can happen at any age, and that it requires a yes, and you can remove that yes at any time, and that needs to be respected by the partner that you're engaging in that sexual activity with, right? Because then it does become a crime, right? It becomes a form of abuse, and we go back to that definition of sexual violence or sexual abuse that we talked about earlier. And it's important to understand that you have the right to report it or not, right? When it comes to children, again, we have to report that abuse, whether we suspect it, whether we believe it, whether we know that a child is being abused. That needs to be reported. But as adults, we get to choose. You get to choose whether you want to report that abuse, and you get to report that abuse at any time. Now, I think it's important for folks to understand that it might be difficult if you choose to report that abuse after the statute of limitations have run out here in Texas, right? That to hold that individual and that offender accountable, right? That can be really difficult. And so TASA, part of our work is at the policy level and advocating for laws and policies that protect, that ensure justice for victims and survivors, that hold offenders and perpetrators accountable. But we can't do that work alone, right? We need individuals like yourself to join us as a membership organization. You can become a member and support the work that we do at the upcoming legislative session, or even at the federal level in terms of advocating for funding and support for victims and survivors of sexual violence. So we all have a really active role, again, not just engaging in these conversations, but actively supporting victims and survivors, ensuring that there's policies, that there's laws in place that support and to hold offenders and perpetrators accountable.
I definitely like what you said when you emphasize when it comes to with male survivors that if they have a physical reaction, that doesn't mean that they consented. So I'm very thankful that you brought that up, because some men believe that if they do have a physical reaction, it's like, oh, well, I guess I enjoyed it. And that is not the case. So thank you for emphasizing that and letting us know that that does not mean consent. Physical reaction does not mean consent at all. We've talked about this and we brought this up, and we actually are coming to the kind of to the end of the show. So I want us to go back and reiterate again. If somebody is a victim of sexual violence, a male is a victim of sexual violence, where can they go? Well, let me take a step back first. If somebody is listening and their friend is experiencing this, or they have some type of inkling, they're not for sure, but they might think that their friend is in a situation and they don't know how to approach their friend to address this type of conversation, to see their friend may be going through a situation like this. What can they do? What can a friend do? Because a lot of times we tend to tell our friends, I know I've done a couple of these, and I say, don't be judgmental, don't judge your friend. Be there for your friend and be a listening ear. But what are some of the things that if somebody's listening and their friend is experiencing this right now, what can they do? And who can they reach out to?
Yeah, I would encourage folks to share this right now, right? Share this across all of your social media platforms. Encourage, especially with the boys and men in your life, tag them on this Facebook Live recording and share it with them and check in with them, right? I think that's so important, is that we just plant some seeds in terms of this conversation, that that this should be a part of our regular conversations with the boys and men in our lives, especially if we're in positions of influence, whether it's on social media or whether we're a coach or a mentor or a teacher or a counselor, whatever our position is, in our community. Just by engaging it, then boys and men know, hey, Emiliano is a safe person that I can go and talk to, not because of his job, but because he understands, he has shared information related to sexual violence and sexual abuse around male survivors. And so people know that they can come to me and that they can talk to me and that they can disclose their experiences. I would also encourage folks to reach out to their local rape crisis center. Familiarize yourself with who your local rape crisis center is. If you don't know, I would encourage you to go to www.rainn.org, and they can connect you with your local rape crisis center. That's the most important resource for male survivors of sexual violence. Encourage them to go online. They can actually text. They don't even need to talk. They can text chat with a victim hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they will connect them to their local rape crisis center for ongoing support and for services. That is the most important resource that we can share with any survivor of sexual violence or sexual abuse.
What I would add to that is that when you are talking to a male survivor or any survivor of sexual assault, is to remember to let them be in control of their story. There have been multiple times, I know from my end, when I'm handling a case, I know what I want to see happen. I know what I want to take, I know what I would like to see happen, but it's not up to me. It's not my story. And so understand that not only do you need to believe the survivor, but you also need to let them be in control of their own story. If they're coming to you because they're looking for resources, then listen and be willing to do that. Don't make them feel bad if they don't want to, go to the police, or if they want to handle it in a particular way. You have to understand that this is their story, and no one knows their story like they do, and you're not in control of that. So just be sure that you are listening, that you are available, that you believe them, and that you're able to, assist with providing the resources that they need.
And Chris, do you want to add anything to that?
No, that's perfect. I mean, that, as we were talking about, being there for a friend, just understanding that it's their decision. Just because someone's confided in you doesn't mean that conveys a responsibility on you to go out and try and take any action on their behalf. It's we talked about the difference between adults and children. With the children, we're going to report that. But if it's an adult, we're not going to rob them of their right to be determinative of their own lives and their own future and having that control. But just being there, and at some point or another, just the fact that you're there can make all the difference.
So now let's go back with the children, though. So like you said, with adults, if they don't ask you to report, then you don't have to, and give them time and lead up to that. But with children, if children are being abused, who can they report that to? Like if they go to their teacher, or if they tell their parent, or even if they tell another parent, like if they're at somebody's house and they tell that person's parent, who can the adult report those incidents to?
Well, everybody in the state of Texas, at least, if you're an adult and you have a suspicion that a child is being abused, you have a responsibility, regardless whether you're a teacher or someone in a position of authority or someone who's a mandatory reporter. We're all mandatory reporters. And that adult has a responsibility to make that report to Child Protective Services. And there are different methods for doing that. There's an online way of doing that. There's also the telephonic, where you call it in. It's important to understand that the time periods for response, as far as the agency's protocols are concerned, those vary depending on whether you're making that report through their web portal versus calling it in. If you believe there's an immediate danger, like an immediate threat of harm, then that may need to be a phone call to 911 to your local law enforcement. And so it's important to understand that there are differences there. If you believe that there's ongoing abuse, you may have to sit on hold if you make that phone call, but it may be better to go ahead and make that phone call than to put it into the portal, because it may be a little bit more delayed then.
Is it safe for somebody to go into the house and try to remove the children? Like if a parent sees their another child being abused. So a parent has a son at school and he's friends with another boy at school, and the boy comes and tells, I've been abused. Is it safe for somebody to go into the home and try to remove the child while they're waiting on CPS or law enforcement?
Yeah, I mean, what you're asking in terms of, is bystander intervention, right? So
right.
The practice of intervening when we're witnessing violence or abuse, it's always safest, and I appreciate what Chris said in terms of calling 911. You do not want to put yourself at risk, or the victim or survivor at risk in terms of that situation escalating. And so you always want to call 911 in that situation. I think if you overhear something, if you suspect something, it's important, especially if you're a young person watching this, to talk to an adult in your life, a trusted adult, who then has that responsibility to report that, right? That's their responsibility. The onus, the responsibility is again around child abuse is on us as adults, as professionals, as educators, again, as adults, right? Everyone is responsible for reporting that abuse. But I think if we, there's a fantastic book that I would encourage our entire audience to watch called The Gift of Fear by Kevin DeBecker. And I think it's such an important book, not just for victims and survivors, but for everyone to read. He also wrote a book called Protecting the Gift, which is about trusting our instinct, believing in, trusting our gut when we have a sense that something is happening, that something doesn't feel right, that we believe, that we suspect that something is happening, then we should do something about it, right? We need to act on that gut, that instinct that we're having. That's so important. So even if you suspect, if you believe, do something, right? You don't know how important it is just to do something, because you could ultimately save that victim or survivor's life, and you could potentially hold that offender accountable for the first time within our system. So I think that's really important for folks that are watching to understand. I want to share some specific resources for male survivors. There are a number of national organizations there's one called malesurvivor.org. definitely encourage any male survivor of any form of sexual violence or sexual abuse to check out malesurvivor.org. 1 in 6 is specifically for male survivors of childhood sexual abuse. So if you've experienced some form of abuse in your childhood and you're ready to get support and you're ready to do the healing work, they offer a 24-hour text hotline on their website through RAINN. And they also offer virtual support groups for male survivors of childhood sexual abuse. So that's 1in6.org. And then there's another organization called Men Healing, which is a really wonderful organization that provides these therapeutic retreats for male survivors and their family members and their friends, anyone who's been impacted by that survivor's abuse. And so definitely check out Men Healing, support all these organizations, donate, volunteer, share that information across your social media platforms. That's so easy for us to do these days. And again, you don't really know who it might, who that's following you might need that information. And again, you could ultimately be saving their life. And so I just want to encourage folks to check out and to support all the male survivors in your life and in your community. Because the more that we do that, the more that male survivors will come forward, and the more we'll have these conversations, and the more that those reports will increase and those offenders will be held accountable. So this is just a first step of a long journey that we've been on. And so hopefully everyone can do their part.
And one last question for each of y'all. Have you seen an increase of male survivors seeking assistance while we've been in this pandemic?
We have not seen an increase. Jessica?
I can say that I haven't, but I think it's happening. I think it's just going unreported. If you think about what kind of issues the pandemic has caused for survivors, a lot of times, especially with children, because they weren't going to school during this time, and they weren't going to the places that they can consider to be safe places, whether that's daycare or a babysitter or wherever, they have been trapped inside with their abusers a lot of the time. And so I don't think in our office we have seen an increase, but I'm pretty sure there has been an increase in male survivors just based off of the situation and how hard it is at this point when people are unable to work, when they're unable to go to school, and when they're dealing with situations where moving around is not as easy. Getting into a shelter is not as easy. So leaving a sexually violent situation is not going to be easy during this time. And so whereas we're not seeing an increase in the office, I'm certain there has been, an increase going on out in the world. Yeah.
Have you seen any?
Yeah, I think if you talk to your individual rape crisis center, the rape crisis center in your community, they will probably have a lot of stories and specific data about just the rates of the increase in calls, over their hotlines, their 24-hour hotlines for victims and survivors. That might include boys and men who are reaching out. But a lot of boys and men are accessing services online, right? Whether it's some sort of virtual therapy or virtual support groups that we talked about, like that 1in6 provides. So they have seen an uptick in terms of boys and men accessing information online. That's really critical because we might not be comfortable going into an office that we traditionally think of as serving girls and women, right? We may not be comfortable calling a 24-hour hotline because we don't necessarily think of ourselves as a victim of sexual violence or rape, right? So it's important that men have access to these exclusively male spaces for survivors, right? Where they can access information that's really designed for them wherever they are at in their process, right? And so you'll find a whole bunch of additional resources for men that are choosing to do that work on their own, right? That are choosing to do that work through their faith, that's faith-based. Maybe they're talking to a therapist. So maybe they're just reading an article, reading a book, watching a documentary. There's a number of ways to heal from sexual violence. You don't have to go to your rape crisis center to do that work. And so it's really important to know that that is there. It's a resource, that legal aid is a resource, but that ultimately you get, like we talked about, I cannot tell you how important it is for them to decide how they want to proceed with their healing, right? And when they want to do their healing. It's not up to us, right? It's up to them. And when they're ready, we want to be prepared. We want to have all the information that we can to share with them. We want to encourage them to access all of these services and support. But ultimately, they get to decide. We have to empower, like their power is taken away from them. And this is an opportunity for us to empower them and for them to decide what's best for them in their healing journey. But hopefully this also helps with, after seeing this, you're ready. You know that there are people that are ready to support you, whether it's legal aid or any of the resources that we shared in today's Facebook Live.
Well, thank you for this great conversation. I really appreciate you all being a guest today. We worked through our technical difficulties and it ended up being a really great show. So I really thank you and thank you for bearing with us. Again, I just want to reiterate that this show is for informational purposes. We are not here providing legal advice. However, I want each of our guests to, again, let them know how they can reach you if somebody who is watching this is needing help legally or even as an advocate, please reach out. Do not sit in silence because there are those there that are willing to help. You can contact here, like Lone Star Legal Aid. You can contact us via the website, or you can reach out to us if you're 713-652-0077 if you're in the Houston area, but we also have a 1-800 number. And I also, again, want our guests to provide, their resources. So if anybody, again, if you know somebody, if you are and you're needing assistance, please reach out. Emiliano, please let them know how they can contact you.
Yeah, would encourage folks to visit us at TASA.org online, to follow us on social media, to consider becoming a member of TASA. If you're a victim or survivor of sexual violence, we definitely would encourage you to join us as a member. If you're an advocate, if you're a family member, a friend, if you're just an ally of victims and survivors, if you're a man that wants to support victims and survivors, we definitely encourage you to volunteer and to donate your time at your local rape crisis center. Get involved, right? Speak up and speak out. If you're a survivor, share your story, when you're ready. And we really believe and know that as a result of that, more male survivors will come forward. But most importantly, all the resources that were shared in the chat, please access them. If you're not sure who or where to get support, definitely visit or call RAINN. They're a 24-hour hotline, both online and you can call. And again, all of that is confidential. And all of these services are free. So that's really important for you to know. They're accessible to anybody, regardless of your age, your race, your sexual orientation, even your citizens, your status as a resident or a citizen or as an immigrant that's undocumented in this country. It doesn't matter. Regardless of what language you speak, all those services are available to you, again, at no cost when you're ready.
And Jessica?
So we actually, you can actually get in contact with us. We've got an 800 number as well. We are located in Dallas, and we are the LASA unit for Legal Aid of Northwest Texas. Our website is www.LAN as in Nancy, WT as in Tom.org. And that is how you get to our offices in multiple counties. But to get to us specifically outside of referrals, you can call our 800 number or our toll-free number. It is 877-807-7294. And that will allow anyone who is looking for advice or legal assistance to leave a message, a safe number with us so that we can get back in contact with them and provide them with the information that it is that they need. We also take referrals from different community and network agencies, and that is another way to get in touch with us. So if we have a survivor who is seeking counseling or is seeking resources from the multiple agencies around the state, then they can also send us referrals. I would just encourage everybody to check out LandWid's website in order to apply for services that can be done online, as well as get information for the legal aid line and for each individual office in the counties that we are able to serve.
And there's
Go ahead.
There's a 1-800 number for our general legal aid line. It's 1-888-529-5277. Monday through Friday, 9 to 4.
Do y'all also do legal clinics, or are y'all doing legal clinics when we're in a pandemic?
We do legal clinics. I believe that some of our offices are doing virtual clinics. So we're adapting. I know that everybody is online now and doing a lot of things via Zoom. But there's a lot of great platforms. The one we're on right now is a great platform. There's Zoom. There's Microsoft has a platform. So utilizing all of those tools. However, we need to reach out to. We're doing outreach to our agency partners right now, actively presenting about what legal aid can do for their clients and for our partners. And we're doing those outreaches via Zoom, and Ring Central is I think one of the other platforms we're using now. So we're in a kind of a virtual world now.
Yeah, we're doing the same at Lone Star Legal Aid too. We're doing virtual clinics via Zoom and other platforms as well. So again, if you know somebody, or if you are a victim or a survivor of sexual assault, please reach out, and do not suffer in silence. You're not alone. We are here to help legally and mentally, and physically and emotionally. We're definitely here to help, and there's a lot of resources out there. So I thank you again for being a part of our show. I really appreciate each of you being here. It was very informative, and so I appreciate it. And hopefully somebody out there listening will definitely reach out. So we will have our next Facebook Live the first Thursday of December. So please stay tuned to the next one. And everybody have a good afternoon. Thank you again.
Thanks.